Today's first lesson will be on turning.
24.
Hey, Patrick,
What?
I thought of something funnier than 24.
Let me hear it.
25.
Ahoy, mateys, and welcome to another episode of I'm Ready, a SpongeBob SquareCast. My name is Captain Eric, and we are continuing our sail through the third season of SpongeBob SquarePants. Today's episode is New Student Starfish. It is the first half of the 53rd episode of SpongeBob, and it first premiered on September 20th, 2002. It was written by Paul Tibbitt, Ken Osborne, and Mark O'Hare. Our storyboard artists are Carson Kugler, Heather Martinez, William Reese, and Mike Roth. Our storyboard directors are Paul Tibbitt and Ken Osborne. Our animation director is Tom Yasumi, and our creative director is Derek Dryman. If at any point during your time in school, whether it's elementary or primary school, middle school, high school, college, if you ever brought a friend along, with you to a class that they didn't belong to, or you were that friend that went to a class that you didn't belong to, and this is an episode that will probably spark memories of those moments, if you happen to have any. If you attended another class and didn't goof off or get in any trouble or anything like that, then maybe this episode won't bring up any sort of those memories. But I don't know. I have one in particular, and this episode reminds me of it, and we'll get to that later. But if by the logo of this episode doesn't give it away, we are of course dealing with a school setting, and not just any school setting. We are of course going to Bikini Bottom's only known school in town, Mrs. Puff's boating school. And when it's not normally a boating school, well, it's always a boating school. But in some episodes, it is a normal driving school, a one-room building, maybe a bathroom or two, and that's it, a driving track outside. That's all you would really need. But in other episodes, sometimes this school expands on itself and becomes more of what you would expect in an elementary school or a middle school, with lockers and stairs, a second floor, hallways, and what happened here with Mrs. Puff's? Now, if you go back and look at any of the dialogue that went around during the pre-production of SpongeBob SquarePants, Nickelodeon wanted SpongeBob to be a bit younger. They wanted him to be able to go to school so that they could tell stories that have to do with school. But Steven and a lot of the other, creative minds working behind the show didn't necessarily want to just make SpongeBob a kid. He is an adult. He lives on his own. He has a job. But the caveat was to put him in boating school so that this place that he could attend for certain stories could then expand on itself to tell school, quote-unquote-esque stories and have a little bit of fun and put SpongeBob back in situations where he's skewed on a little bit of the younger side, but it still works out in their world, hence the fact that he's going to boating school. And if also the title of this episode didn't give it away, we are also dealing with a Patrick episode, given I don't think there could ever be a SpongeBob SquarePants episode that has Starfish in the title that wouldn't deal with Patrick whatsoever. So we have a Mrs. Puff's boating school Patrick episode, a combo that we don't necessarily get to see all the time, and boy, do we go on one nice ride in this episode. But before we even get to Mrs. Puff's, I got to mention this opening sequence here, this very quick opening sequence of some sort of morning, wake up machine for invention for SpongeBob. Now, it's not as fancy as these other two that I'm going to mention, but it just reminds me of the opening sequence of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, the whole Rube Goldberg type machine that Pee-wee has running his whole breakfast of his house. But this also reminds me of Wallace and Gromit. Specifically now, what I'm talking about here is apparently right when SpongeBob wakes up, Gary has a button in front of him that when Gary presses it, it sends SpongeBob's bed like a spring and sends SpongeBob shooting out. Now, we have seen that part in previous episodes before. We have seen SpongeBob's bed do that and fling SpongeBob out to, various parts of the room, most specifically a calendar, a massive calendar that he has on one wall. But for this specific morning, the bed flings him out into his library chair, which apparently already has a hot cup of tea waiting for him. He bounces off of that chair. While that's happening, Gary, after pressing the button, goes over to a toaster, puts in some bread, pushes the plunger down of the toaster, and then the toast spits out of the air. SpongeBob grabs it in his mouth while he's coming back down after bouncing off of the chair into his square pants. Ladies and gentlemen, there we have it, a morning well done, except for the fact that SpongeBob kind of mentions that the toast could be a little bit darker next time, and Gary gives a little bit of an annoyed face. That right there, this has to be some sort of homage to Wallace and Gromit, because it just reminds me of of course, the invention of waking up in the morning. There's always some sort of contraption that Wallace has to aid his morning escapades, but just the fact that he, would throw little, not passive aggressive, but just kind of, things to Gromit to change, little notes like, you could do this differently, lad. And Gromit would give that real annoyed, look. And just this moment here between SpongeBob and Gary, all of it just screams Wallace and Gromit to me. And I love that. I absolutely love it. Before SpongeBob gets to leave the house, he is interrupted by Patrick. Patrick comes over because, it's time for them to play. But, of course, this given a completely different Mrs. Puff's experience, SpongeBob now has a seemingly different school schedule. He's actually attending school. It's a full 8-hour day type school. It's not just like a 1 hour or 2 hour class, which one would expect for a boating school. But this whole little dialogue sequence that happens in the beginning here between SpongeBob and Patrick, one of the most adorable, endearing Patrick moments, I think, in the show's run. Maybe that's a bit much. Maybe that's a bit heavy. But I really think about it. It's such an adorable, cute sequence. I've used this kind of back and forth in real life before of, just even somebody who knows of the show, like, what do you do when I'm doing this? Wait for you to get back. It's an absolutely perfect response. The performance of Patrick here, it's just Bill Fagerbacke absolutely knocks it out of the park with Patrick in this episode. He always steps up. He always steps up to the plate. He never pulls back when it comes to Patrick, but there's something really endearing about Patrick in this episode. I can't put my finger on it, but that moment really helps solidify that in this episode. SpongeBob then comes up with the great idea that he should just bring Patrick to school with him, which, fair enough. It is a boating school. Patrick, for all I know, doesn't have his boating license. So he can go to the school, get his boating license. Shouldn't be a big deal for him to attend. Now, this is where, this is like 6:30 in the morning, just about, or 6:20. SpongeBob said he was running late to school, but classes don't start until 9, or I think 10. Either way, SpongeBob is arriving to the school hours before his classes start, which is absolutely a SpongeBob thing to do. We've seen this guy go into the Krusty Krab at like 3 or 4 in the morning to count the sesame seeds. This guy has a complete level of dedication that is unbeknownst to most people. And it's crazy. Who shows up to school that early? Especially if there's nothing to do. If you have something to do, sure. But yeah, it's the one thing that I guess is nice about this is he gets to give Patrick a tour of the school without there being a single soul, not even a janitor in the hallways. The school is completely empty. And we get to see parts of Mrs. Puff's boating school that we've never seen before, and honestly, we will rarely ever see it again, only when there's a need for Mrs. Puff's boating school to expand to this level. But SpongeBob gives Patrick a nice little tour around Mrs. Puff's boating school. Every little bit of it, including the classroom, which is mainly the only part of Mrs. Puff's that we know 110% is real, this one-room classroom. And in it, there are two things of note that we should talk about that are very specific for this episode. One of which is the Good Noodle Board, which this is going to be, of course, different for a lot of people because depending on where you went to school and ultimately who taught you, because a lot of the decorations and sometimes gimmicks in these classrooms are at the feet of the teacher to do. And there are some kids out there who get to experience really creative and fun teachers who go out of their way to, present at least a different aspect to your everyday lives, such as a good noodle board. And then sometimes there's teachers that, hey, that's just not their bag. That's not what they do. They don't create extra stuff like this. They're here to teach you. And I get it. But this is, so you might have gone throughout your entire career in school without ever coming across a system like the Good Noodle Board, rewarding somebody with little stickers. I certainly have had teachers who have done that. I, for the life of me, cannot remember any of the systems. I remember in elementary school, they had Student of the Month, which every month, every grade, every class would elect a student to be Student of the Month. I didn't win mine until the 4th grade. And not that I was a bad kid, but I as I've mentioned before, there was just a lot of cases where it was just like wrong place, wrong time, teacher looking at Eric, gotcha, Captain. And so I had one teacher, my 4th grade teacher, probably one of my favorite teachers in my entire school history, really got behind me and really helped push me to an entirely new level of maturity that got me to win Student of the Month. And it was a great feeling. It was like being a good noodle for a day and winning that award and then having my family at that assembly. It's a moment in time I will never forget. It's a core memory that I'll never forget. And that teacher connected with it. I'll never forget her on that. But for the life of me, other than Student of the Month, I can't remember any other aspects. I know in 5th grade, our teacher would have a constant supply of Laffy Taffy, little Laffy Taffies. And if you ever did something good or, got a question right, or if she just deemed fit, she would just hand out a Laffy Taffy to the kids. I know that that's not the greatest thing in the world. And also, let me just say, it's not like she was handing out these pieces of candy like 10 a day or anything. It was like a once in a while, like you had to do something really good to earn it. But it looks like that the system here that Mrs. Puff has put in place pretty much honors anybody who can excel at literally anything. And it just seems that, of course, SpongeBob is just miles ahead of everybody else. Lloyd, Sheila, Paco, Debbie, and Horace, all trailing behind SpongeBob. Now, visually, he has about 24 good noodle stars on the board, but according to SpongeBob, he has 74 good noodle stars, which means either he has obviously earned more than enough to fill the board, so it just means that there's more stars just off the board somewhere else that he's earned, or the 74 is his cumulative throughout the year, and what you see before you is maybe just the current semester or the current week or the current month of good noodle stars, his earnings. But yeah, according to SpongeBob, he has 74 good noodle stars. I think it's something really fun for Mrs. Puff to do. Any sort of little honor system is always going to be something nice. Earning those stars are going to hopefully be a good feeling for those people. It's kind of a shame that we really don't see Patrick, although we see his name get written on the board there, we don't see him earn a good noodle star throughout this episode. I don't know if anyone has ever actually sat back and thought about that for just 1 second, but I feel like we lost an opportunity there to see Patrick earn his very first good noodle star. The other part of this classroom that is unique for this episode is Roger. Roger is the class pet, but also it seems to be like the class metaphor for driving and knowing knowledge to be safe. And essentially Roger is an egg. It is an unhatched egg that, for the size of the characters and the show and everything that we know about the upper world and underwater. It doesn't make sense, for one, especially given the ending. But either way, it is an egg inside of a cage, like a glass kind of like fish tank, if you will. But it's an egg sitting there, and then it's got a single light bulb above it, which apparently is supposed to be a metaphor of knowledge and what. SpongeBob goes through this whole diatribe of what Roger means, what the light bulb means, and yeah, I don't buy it. I think he's just the class pet. I don't think Mrs. Puff is deep enough to put so much thought into Roger and what he means and the metaphor. I don't believe that. I think that's just all a SpongeBob thing that he's putting on to the reasoning behind why they have this class egg. I feel like Mrs. Puff being lazy enough to just get an egg, throw it in a tank and call it a day and just say, that's our class pet. That feels like a Mrs. Puff thing to do. Just full on cut corners and just get the cheapest pet possible. You don't even have to take care of it. She's probably not even expecting that thing to really hatch. I mean, it's underwater. I don't know what the thought process would be there. Now, we get to finally see the class start, and Mrs. Puff immediately recognizes that there's a new student in the classroom, and I got to give props for the way that she presented herself with a new student in the classroom. Gives him the chance to kind of introduce himself and talk to the class. And we get this really iconic moment in SpongeBob history. I know I already said that for another part of this episode, but come on now. 24, 25, this is some of the best moments in SpongeBob history with just some very simple numbers. Taking something so simple as the number 25 and making it one of the funniest jokes in SpongeBob history. I mean, an entire generation out there can laugh at hearing one number, which, if anything, speaks extremely high to the writing staff of this show at this time, to be able to take something so simple as characters laughing and giggling at a number, and it all of a sudden just becomes a cultural inside joke that, who knows 150 years from now if there's even going to still be people who get that joke, who find it funny. But we'll find out eventually. I can tell you it'll still be funny in 25 years. Now, what happens here is Patrick mistakenly says his name is 24 to the crowd, to the classroom, and when sitting down, doesn't really understand why the whole classroom is laughing at him, because it would be funny if somebody just went up and said their name was 24. And now Mrs. Puff certainly not impressed by this whatsoever. She immediately knows the kind of student she's going to have to be dealing with in Patrick. So when Patrick sits down, he's really confused as to why everybody is laughing at him saying 24. SpongeBob knows, hey, it's in the timing of what you said. Although I think it's just, he could have said really anything other than his name, anything really silly. I think that crowd is just desperate for just some sort of entertainment. I don't know why I keep calling him a crowd. It's the classroom. It's the other students. I just think they're desperate for anything different, anything other than the mundane, boring daily routine of going to Mrs. Puff's boating school. So a new student coming up and saying their name is 24, hilarious. SpongeBob comes up with something that is funnier than 24 because they just start uncontrollably laughing about it. And of course the joke being there, 25, which then, by the way, every single cake out there of a 25-year-old who then gets that image made onto the cake is just awesome. I absolutely love every single 25-year-old's cake that just makes the SpongeBob joke. Come on. What single joke out there has made more cakes than that SpongeBob joke? That has to have the Guinness World Record for that. I don't know. There's obviously no way of really tracking that, but I got to feel confident in saying that there's not another joke that has made it onto more cakes than the 25 joke from SpongeBob. That's got to be a thing. As far as Captain Erica is concerned, that's just a fact at this point. Now, right after this exchange, Patrick then decides to interrupt SpongeBob with a drawing he made of Mrs. Puff. a very crude looking drawing that calls Mrs. Puff a big fat meanie and also puts a little piece of poop next to her as if she had just done that. Mrs. Puff, he passes the drawing over to SpongeBob, and SpongeBob's not amused with this drawing whatsoever. He knows it's not fun to make fun of the teacher, and he likes Mrs. Puff, so he thinks it's really rude. And of course, in classic fashion, you can see this coming a mile away. While the drawing is in SpongeBob's hand, Mrs. Puff then grabs it, takes a look at the photo, and we get probably one of the not only top 3 jokes of this episode, but it's probably one of the top 3 best Mrs. Puff jokes in the show's run. But when Mrs. Puff looks at this drawing of herself, this really crude looking drawing, the camera then cuts to a wider shot of her right next to SpongeBob, and she is now drawn exactly like the picture. And and she seems to be more offended that the drawing doesn't really look like her than the contents of the drawing. The fact that her response is as if I really look like this, and she doesn't really mention anything else. And if you notice during that moment, there's even a little drawn piece of poop right on the floor there. It's not brown or anything. It's just kind of black marks, black blotches, but they're in the same area next to Mrs. Puff as they are in the drawing. So they're only there for a split second. But it's really funny that they added those there in the first place. They didn't have to. They really didn't have to. They could have just kept it to Patrick's drawing. And at this point, now that SpongeBob has disrupted the class twice, it is time for him to lose a good noodle star. Mrs. Puff takes out a tiny little shovel, the size of a razor, if you were shaving your facial hair. A little tiny shovel. She goes up, clips off one of SpongeBob's stars in this kind of prolonged, elongated sequence to just go over how devastating this is for SpongeBob. This is one of the worst things that could happen to the guy. He has earned those good noodle stars with hard work, determination, and sweat. Mostly his sweat. But the fact that now that one gets taken away because of Patrick, this is really inappropriate. Which, if I didn't mention before, the whole 25 fiasco of them constantly giggling about 25 caused Mrs. Puff to kind of shout out to them to stop disrupting the class. So there was already a moment where Mrs. Puff had addressed SpongeBob on his disruptions with Patrick. So now this is the second time, and he loses a good noodle star because of it. And even worse is he loses his privileges of sitting at the front of the class, and now he has to go sit at the back of the class where all the misfits sit. The kids that don't want to be there have to sit. And we get this visual joke of when SpongeBob goes to the back, it seemingly is in the back corner of the room that no one has worked on ever. Probably since the building has been built. But it's just this one corner of the room where the walls are broken. You can see the brick behind them. The floorboards are dirty. It's disgusting. There's papers everywhere. It's just, the chair is dingy and gross. There's markings all over the walls. School is for nematodes. Wow, what kind of kids are sitting back here? What kind of lowlifes? The ones who can't even hear Mrs. Puff from the back of the room, so that they don't even have to pay attention. So they just draw on their desk. School is for chumps. SpongeBob doesn't belong back there. He doesn't belong in an area where down with learning is above all. Which is another piece of graffiti on the desk there, down with learning. This whole part of the room clearly, meant to be the classrooms where there are certainly more troubled students, and there's just the ones that'll sit in the back and draw on their desks, the ones that don't want to pay attention to the teacher. And normally, if you don't want to pay attention to your teacher, the further away you're going to sit from them. That's kind of the point. That's the joke here. I certainly love the whole visual difference going back and forth, even with Patrick and SpongeBob, just seeing like they kept up the joke of just how dark and disgusting this one corner of the room is. We go through an entirely other sequence here where Patrick is trying to get SpongeBob's attention, and SpongeBob is trying to ignore him. He already lost one good noodle star. He's not looking to get in any more trouble, and Patrick is just not getting in trouble himself. He's seemingly skirting all responsibility of this situation. Now, the whole idea of being in a classroom that you don't belong in, causing some trouble, or just being an overall nuisance. Now, when I was a bit younger, I had a friend who was going to come and stay over my house, but before he could stay over, he had to attend his weekly CCD class, which is more of religious learning for the church that he was a part of. And I had, I still wanted to hang out with him for, I think he was going to be gone for an hour until he would come back to my house. So I asked him, like, hey, can I go with you to your CCD class? And he said, yeah, sure. I don't see why that's not a problem. So I went along with him to his class. We went to the school. It was within a walking distance, so we walked over. And we went in, and the teacher definitely does not like having other people in the class who are not meant to be there. I remember telling off the bat that this woman was extremely uncomfortable with just a random kid coming in to be taught. I can also see the other hand, other teachers taking that and seeing it as an opportunity to like maybe bring another person into this group and a part of this classroom. But this woman was the exact opposite. And look, I will tell you, my friend and I, certainly nuisances in the room, but what ended up happening was just absolutely completely out of my control. I had a bit of an upset stomach that day, and I had, unfortunately, during a quiet session of the classroom, I tried to hold back wind, but ended up letting out a fart that echoed, not only in the classroom, but in the hallway. And I swear to the 7 C's, I was not trying to purposely make it as loud as it was. I was literally trying to hold back. I should have went to the bathroom, but uncomfortable situation, uncomfortable building I've never been in. I just saw fit to just stay still. And it happened. It happened. It was bad. I made the class laugh. It was very much like Patrick's 24 moment. The problem was I didn't have a teacher there that was just like, move on, oh, another one of these. I was immediately kicked out of that class and just kicked out of the building, and never went to a CCD class again. I don't know what to tell you. It didn't really seem too inviting for me, but it's an unfortunate moment. I'm glad it happened. Looking back on it, it certainly makes me laugh. I feel bad for that teacher. I wish she knew my intentions were not to disrupt her class, but my body, I guess, saw it differently than what I did. Now, Patrick goes through a crazy time trying to get SpongeBob's attention in this situation, and it ends up making SpongeBob look even worse and gets him even more trouble. These are one of those situations where, and I'm sure we could all think of a time with a sibling or a friend, a classmate, where it just seemed like it was always one-sided. If any situation, you would be the one getting caught. You would be the one being noticed. I can certainly think of a situation or two with a sibling or a friend of feeling like the SpongeBob in this situation, where it's just like, can you look over and see that other person doing all of this? Stop looking over at me and paying attention to me. I'm not doing anything wrong. I generally feel bad for SpongeBob in this whole episode. He was trying to do something really nice for Patrick, and it ended up ruining a bit of his relationship there with Mrs. Puff, and even putting him at odds with Patrick too, who is completely oblivious to literally everything going on, even asking Mrs. Puff if it's nap time, which means that he at least remembers nap time from his days of going to school, but that's about all he remembers. So the two of them eventually get into an argument. Now, this is weird. There is apparently a recess portion of your boating school experience. So if you're an adult and you're going to boating school to learn, you also then have a recess as well, which is pretty cool. I wish I still had recess up until the later years of my schooling. I wish there was just a designated recess time. Although when you're in college, when you're not in a class, you can kind of do what you want, and you're basically in recess at that point. But the whole conversation between the two characters out in the hallway, one of my highlights of this episode, Patrick coming over completely oblivious to all of the negativity he's brought onto SpongeBob. SpongeBob's like really the anger that he has over losing that good noodle star. He is hurt by that. And the two of them decide to fight. They're going to have a school fight right here in the middle of the hallway. And a bunch of students just crowd around him. They want to see a fight. They want to see these two beat the ever-living barnacles out of one another. And as you're watching them punch each other, you then look over at the crowd and they go from cheering fight to nothing. They stop cheering and they start noticing that SpongeBob and Patrick are just absolutely terrible at fighting and are just kind of punching the air at one another. In comes Mrs. Puff, who then decides, finally she brought some justice onto Patrick and is not just coming over and blaming SpongeBob as she's been doing throughout the entire episode. But she comes over, notices that these two are fighting, and this is the last straw for Mrs. Puff. She is now bringing on another portion of boating school that you didn't think was a part of boating school: detention. Apparently, you can pay to go to boating school and get a detention. That's crazy. That's really crazy. But as I mentioned, this entire episode it's changing up the entire facade and inner workings of Mrs. Puff's to fit this school level narrative that they wanted to tell. So the fact that these two are fighting, she gives them both immediate detention. And while they're stuck in detention, which I'm guessing instead of just having a separate room in the school for detention, it's just Mrs. Puff's classroom, because as far as I know, there is only one solid room in this school, that and the bathroom. That's all I've ever seen thus far in the episodes in the run. We'll get to more, but as they're sitting here in the classroom, they're throwing out angry barbs at one another, which it reminds me, it's just another childhood thing. When hurt people hurt, when you're feeling down, you want to just throw hurtful things at a person who hurt you because you want them to understand how you're feeling, because that's all what we're looking for. We're looking for mutual understandings. And so these two are just throwing all of these angry barbs at one another. And once Roger is brought into question, and that there would still be hate on the table if Roger's light bulb went out. Of course, Roger's light bulb goes out. A light bulb that we have been told is the life force to keep Roger alive. That there is no other heat source underwater to keep this egg alive other than this light bulb. The two characters obviously still at odds with one another over earlier events prolong their help of Roger in this situation until they eventually put together their teamwork and decide that they have to help the class pet. SpongeBob decides to keep Roger nice and warm while Patrick heads over to the utility closet to get a new light bulb. One of my favorite jokes in this episode is when he opens up the utility closet to get a light bulb. He sees there's a light bulb, and we get this big shot of a massive mountain of light bulbs. And the camera zooms up to what Patrick was talking about, and it's in fact the one working, plugged in light bulb at the very top of the mountain, and completely ignoring the fact that there are literally hundreds to possibly thousands of light bulbs in this room. So, and we also get a nice little shout out here. It reminds me of the Price is Right of the yodeling man. We get Patrick climbing up the side of the light bulb mountain here in a nice classic. Is it Dutch? The yodeling is from. He's just in the classic attire you would expect someone who is a yodeler to be wearing, and even up at the top he's got a big old Matterhorn. And I love the whole joke. I love the reference. The whole aspect of this episode I enjoy. SpongeBob and Patrick's little come together and their teamwork. I absolutely adore it. Patrick gets the light bulb successfully, brings it back to the classroom, and we save Roger's life. Now, luckily, This whole process between the two characters was not lost because Mrs. Puff was watching the entire sequence behind her two-way chalkboard, which I have to imagine a lot of educators out there would like, in the regard that then you can have your superiors watch in your classroom. So when you're trying to tell them how rude some of your kids can be, and they're just hearing hearsay, they're just hearing your word. It's like, no, how about you go into the room behind the chalkboard and watch for yourself and use the two-way board. Although they don't really have chalkboards in many classrooms these days. It's mostly whiteboards. If you are still attending a school out there in the world that uses a chalkboard, please do not feel like you're missing out on whiteboards or smart boards. Enjoy that chalkboard. I miss chalkboards. I hated that they took them out of all schools. I get it. I get that people thought that there were better things, and in ways that they are better, but in other ways, I still miss the chalkboard. Bring it back in classrooms. So relish your chalkboard if you have it. But we get Mrs. Puff, who was watching and saw the entire sequence of events play out in front of her. I don't think that was the plan. I don't think she knew that Roger's light bulb was going to go out and make it an attempt to bring together the teamwork of SpongeBob and Patrick, but that's also a possibility in a weird way. Mrs. Puff is certainly capable of some extremely weird things, so I wouldn't put it past her. But we get this kind of nice moment at the end where SpongeBob gets a bit of redemption for himself with Mrs. Puff and earns back his Good Noodle Star. And I know I said earlier that Patrick, we didn't really get to see him earn one. I more meant that we didn't really get to see him earn one on the board. Like, we didn't get to see a star next to Patrick's name. But he earns one right here with helping out SpongeBob save Roger's life. But Patrick is not interested in boating school. And actually thought that he was attending Spanish class with SpongeBob, which is a completely just hilarious joke on its own. That you sat there all day and you thought this was Spanish class? Like, really? There was not a lick of Spanish. But the chef's kiss moment of this episode is Patrick immediately walking away. Like, once he figures out that it's not Spanish class and that it is boating school, he has no interest and just goes like, yeah, see ya, SpongeBob, see ya, big fat meanie, and walks off to our episode's end. The fact that he actually just flat out calls Mrs. Puff big fat meanie is worth every single penny, is worth the time to get through this episode. What a joke to end on. It's one of my, probably one of my favorite ending jokes of SpongeBob history. There's a lot of weird, top 5, top 10s I could make of very specific kinds of jokes in SpongeBob. And in terms of jokes right at the end of an episode, those last bit stingers right as it ends, this is one of the best ones. Just comes out of left field. You would never expect him to be so blatantly rude. And here's Patrick just being so blatantly rude. And, it's coupled with all of the adorable moments that preceded it. It just makes the character that much more endearing. I can't explain it more beyond that. And that is New Student Starfish. Certainly an episode that reminds me a lot about school. It reminds me of a lot of those specific moments, that one specific story I brought up for you guys. It certainly is still a part of this ongoing streak that we've had in SpongeBob, where all of these episodes are truly top tier of the series. And it's going to continue on through next week in the episode of Clam. So with that is this week's episode of the Squarecast. Thank you so much for listening. And for listeners of the show, if you were a listener of This Week in Nickelodeon History, you can now find that at its very own podcast through Spotify, through Apple Podcasts, through Google Podcasts. Just search up This Week in Nickelodeon History. If you do not find it, I will start having links for the Spotify page of This Week in Nickelodeon History in the podcast description of the Squarecast. So if you're listening right now, you can look at the podcast description and click right on over to start listening to This Week in Nickelodeon History. And I have changed the show up a bit. Starting after episode 52, I wasn't just going to go right back around giving all the same stories, talking about all the same stuff all over again. No. I changed things up. Now it's just strictly about the Nickelodeon channel, kind of cut things off from Noggin and the N and Nicktoons Network, at least for a year, but in its place, I am now covering all of the Nickelodeon video games. That's right, I went through and have an entire calendar filled of all of the different Nickelodeon video game anniversaries, all of the different nuanced, ridiculous titles you've probably never even heard of that I'll be covering week to week on This Week in Nickelodeon History, on top of all of the show anniversaries. So if you've never listened to it and you would like more Captain Eric, I advise you, it is worth checking out. It's a whole completely different vibe and feeling of I'm Ready, a SpongeBob SquareCast, and that is completely okay. If you like any of the shows that I make, produce, and you want to show your support, there are many ways you can do so, none of which are monetary-wise. The first of which is subscribe to the Captain Eric YouTube channel. It's the easiest way you can show your support. Like any of the videos on there. Share them around to any friends or family that you think might enjoy some SpongeBob, Nickelodeon, or any other future content that I create. If you do want to show your support in a monetary way, you can support the show from our anchor page in the podcast description below, and we also have a shop open where there's going to be more designs of more of the current Captain Eric, This Week in Nickelodeon History, and even an updated I'm Ready, a SpongeBob SquareCast logo that you can get on a variety of products like t-shirts and bedding covers and posters and whatever you'd like. So that's going to be updated a bit more soon, and there's going to be a bit more of at least of an acknowledgement that merch exists. But trust me, I've never asked for a dime from any of you guys, and I never will. Being on the Ready crew is completely free of charge, and each and every one of you who have been on the Ready crew, past, present, or future, are always welcome aboard. As always, this is Captain Eric signing off for this week. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you here next week. Please stay safe, everybody.
Boating school? I thought this was Spanish class. See you, SpongeBob. See you, Big Fat Meanie.